So in thinking about the overarching themes for today's talk on machines judging humans, what I want to talk about is I want to connect some ideas that are both from the sphere of legal studies and the sphere of computer science. And I think one of the things that is really an interesting parallel between the fields, and certainly I've been writing a lot and thinking a lot about the nature of what are the similarities and differences between computer science and law. But in both fields, there is often an emphasis on formalizing evaluative criteria, right? On sort of telling people like, we are going to be fair to you because we have a clear set of rules, and these rules are going to embody our values, and they will be applied in a manner that is fair, transparent, consistent over time. And I think that a lot of the energy behind the algorithmic accountability movement over the past 10 years, even going beyond that, has been worries that essentially that these promised evaluative criteria embodying consistency, due process, fairness, and other values actually have turned out, in many instances, not to do so. And then the question becomes, what do we do about that? So I'm going to open today's talk in thinking about some scenarios, and then going further into some legal theory, and then trying to apply it again to some concrete scenarios, including some that we'll introduce at the beginning of the talk. So in thinking about how we relate to AI, machine learning, robotics in our daily lives, I really like this framework and the conclusion of Ilari's and Norbach's work, The Robot Futures, and I call it the Robotic Ultimatum. And what Norbach notices is that today a lot of non-specialists have little say in charting the role that robots will play in our lives, right? It seems as though what we're doing is we're sort of watching from the sideline as the great captains of industry and others are actually scripting the future of AI and robotics. And there are, of course, some advisory roles to these great captains of industry, but by and large, it feels as though there's just not enough public input. And the reason why Norbach is worried about this, and I as well, is because we are moving into a world where we have to read what AIs and machines write. We have to interact with them to conduct our business transactions, and we even mediate our friendships through them. And so in all those ways, this robotic ultimatum is essentially forcing onto us the obligation to think not only in our own natural language, and I think even the moniker natural language as opposed to just language is very interesting that we now use that, but to think about how we are coded by machines as we do that. And the stakes can be very high as that coding occurs. So for example, there's a scenario that I've been working on over the past few years. I haven't published this yet, but I'm particularly interested in the intersection between policing and private ordering mechanisms. Right? I think there's a tremendous work being done now on AI and policing and AI in the military, and there's a lot of great work being done on the issue of commerce and AI and profiling and automated profiling. And one thing I'm wondering about is, what will we do as, for example, there are increasing efforts to rank, rate, and evaluate individuals at this intersection of commerce and social control. So imagine a world where we have a chain of stores that eventually records its customers for thousands of hours to develop a database of tense situations. And I'm sure we've all seen, on Twitter, on other social media, people that come up to a kiosk at the supermarket and they find that they are actually being video recorded on the kiosk. I don't know if that, perhaps the GDPR stops that in much of Europe, but I certainly have seen complaints about it in the US, where people sort of see themselves on the screen. And of course, the supermarkets and others say, well, this is our way to ensure that there won't be shoplifting or stealing from the store. But there's a lot more you can do with that data of how your customers are interacting with the kiosk cashier, right? And so you can also imagine a future where these, as my second bullet point, as part of a pivot to automation, the store could eliminate cashiers in favor of self-service kiosks, something that's happening particularly in lots of areas that are in economic distress. And AI can be marketed as a force multiplier, saying, well, you would have to close the store if you actually had to hire human beings, but given that we have the AI, we can do much more there. And you can imagine a future where essentially to allocate the attention of skeleton crew that remains in these stores, the sort of bare bones staffing that is available, the retailer feeds this footage into an emotion classifying AI system that has been trained on past instances of customer dissatisfaction, security incidents, assaults, and murders. And this is a remarkable sort of trend in, at least in the US. I have not traced it in the rest of the world, in terms of there being violence at stores, violence at many of these places. There's been specials written about Walmart and the amount of local police attention that it demands, just because of the kind of distress and other problems that just tend to occur in some of these few remaining public spaces. And you could further stipulate or hypothesize subroutines that can detect incipient violence and either dispatch an assistant manager to attend to an aggravated customer or an armed security guard to approach an enraged or suspicious one, or to call the police on such a person. And I think where I believe that this really dramatizes both the promise of these types of machines, but I think much more dramatically the perils of them, is that emotion recognition will increasingly be used as there's leaner staffing to make the type of judgment calls that persons were making in the past. And you could say, well, many people are biased, they have forms of discrimination in them, perhaps the AI database will not have those forms of emotion clouding its judgment. But on the other hand, we've also seen lots of research showing that, for example, some AI facial recognition classification systems have been shown to be biased against African Americans in the US and against minorities, in the sense of more easily classifying expressions that would be seen more as neutral on other faces as angry in those cases. And so I think that to me is a really troubling possibility, and something that has led some scholars, like I believe Shaheza Ahmed has recently published a very interesting report on emotion recognition and AI, and talking about the human rights violations potentials as more and more emotion recognition AI moves into more important roles. Now, thinking about those classifications, say someone who's merely aggravated versus someone who's enraged and in that way perhaps a threat to themselves or others, this is admittedly on the frontiers of affective computing, of the effort to parse and to manipulate and to draw out certain emotions in human beings through computing systems. So I'm not saying that anyone in this particular Oxford handbook or in the field is right now trying to make these sorts of machines possible, but they are certainly a logical extension of many existing technologies that I've described in a publication for Real Life magazine called More Than a Feeling. And in that publication, I describe these aggression detectors that record and analyze voices that are already making inroads into schools. So schools will sometimes have these aggression detectors where if the AI system hears a scream or a shout or something like that, people immediately attend to it. And I think this is so troubling and fascinating, but I think mainly troubling because, especially if you think back to your school days, there were lots of situations where emotions are high, people may yell out or whatever it might be. And these are really hard to contextualize, especially for systems that don't know, say, the children involved or others involved. And I think that it does become a worry in those sorts of systems, how that information is being processed, particularly children's information being processed. Is it being recorded? How could that data be used in the future, et cetera? And in my third chapter of New Laws of Robotics, that's one thing I really drill down on, is looking at some of the exceptionally good array of work that's been done in education and AI by critics of behaviorism, including Neil Selwyn, Paul Prinsloo, Audrey Waters, other scholars, who are really showing the negative affordances of this type of distant diagnosis. And I particularly like the idea of distant diagnosis as being an analog to the digital humanities concept of distant reading, right? And there's a sort of a movement among humanities scholars to do distant readings of texts. And I think that in a way, this reflects sort of a distant diagnosis. It's sort of a diagnosis that's being done by a machine of an individual but without the personal responsibility of the professional relationship of, say, doctor to patient, and without the accountability that would, say, directly attached to an individual who made the given diagnosis and then say the diagnosis is wrong. So I think that sort of, then that individual faces consequences, where a lot of times with these systems, consequences are diffused, as so many scholars in algorithmic accountability have called out and been concerned about. And it's fascinating to me that within the, there are even now suicide detection routines on Facebook that can be based on no more than what the person is typing on Facebook, the combination of words, how they're typing, the time they're typing, and there probably are many other data points in there. And on the one hand, these have enormous promise to help stop suicidal individuals and to send in sort of wellness checks or other efforts to stop what might end up to be a suicide. But on the other hand, I think that we have a great opportunity and obligation as a society to think deeply about what this distant diagnosis entails. How is it being used? Why is it that, for example, psychiatric associations and psychological associations have rules of professional responsibility that forbid their members from actually looking at someone out in public and saying, well, that person is insane, or that person is not insane? I mean, then under the sort of professional rules of being a psychiatrist, you really are not to do that. Whereas if you have a personal relationship with someone, then one can. But I think the reason for that distinction is because the power of the psychiatrist or psychologist in the personal relationship can include things like recommending civil commitment. And as long as we're in the realm of marketing, perhaps, we don't necessarily have to worry about that power accruing to those who are running our social media platforms or other networks. But as soon as that starts to potentially include calls to police departments and others that have been documented by Mason Marks in the law review literature or Natasha Singer in the New York Times, then I think we have to start thinking about higher ethical obligations for those AI machine judgments of humans. I'd also note the same about HR departments wanting to use AI to parse applicants' expressions and gestures for nervousness, mood, or behavior patterns. This is another area where I think that as employees, we're increasingly facing situations where we will be judged not necessarily on our work product or what we do, but also on the basis of a mechanical reading of different aspects of our emotional life. Now, of course, again, we can't commit the nirvana fallacy and say that nothing like this was ever done before. Clearly, lots of supervisors and others were always judging people in terms of some level of fit, cultural fit, emotional resonance, appropriateness, all these sorts of vague standards that could indeed be cloaks for discrimination. But I think it's worth particularly regulating what's going on in AI, because first of all, we do have a record, right? We have some sort of record of what data is going into these systems, of what the results are, et cetera. And so even though, of course, we do have the black box problem, we at least have records of certain aspects of inputs and outputs that we can judge and talk about more clearly. Whereas I think sometimes with respect to personal management, we have less of that. And so that to me is like a spur to regulation. The other spur to regulation is the propensity of these systems to spread and grow and to apply a single sort of monocultural model on many different places, as opposed to the present distributed expertise of management. And that to me is another issue. I think we've got to recognize management in many private entities as a form of governance. And we should always worry that when the natural subsidiarity of distributed expertise gets broken up by, say, large international conglomerates selling modes of evaluating persons via a particular algorithmic system, that system, thus by taking on a larger and larger role, should have more and more responsibility. And of course, we see that in European regulation with respect to varying levels of obligation, for example, with respect to very large online platforms versus other platforms, and US regulation as well. So I think that is a logic of a regulation in these scenarios. Also, there's, it's not just about being an employee. Being a customer of a corporation, you're increasingly going to face affective computing, sort of decoding whether you're a good customer or not. And this will go beyond affective computing. It'll be all sorts of profit-driven computing. And consultants have offered insurers facial analysis designed to estimate the real age of applicants. So this is one of those areas where there's companies that go out and say, hey, we all know that people age differently. Some people seem to have aged much more rapidly than others. Wouldn't it be great to know that as a life insurer or someone like that? And at present, life insurance is very often a deeply unregulated field in many jurisdictions, and all sorts of data goes into it. And it's really quite a worrisome world, I think, if we have to worry all the time about do we have enough, say, makeup on, or do we look fresh enough in order to actually avoid being marked down by some sort of facial recognition algorithm that's going to say that our face looks like the face of someone 10 years older than we are. And I think that this is deeply problematic on a number of levels. And I'll get into some of the structure of the normative critique next. Okay, so in thinking about why are these things problematic, I've given some reasons for the problematicity or the normative shortcomings of these AI-driven evaluative systems. Let's sort of break them down chronologically. And I realize that the chronology here is not exactly tight. I am not a historian and not an expert on periodization. But nevertheless, I wanted to give us a chance to think about some initial cut at periodizing, perhaps inspired by Reinhard Koselleck's work in sort of periodization as a way of organizing the past efforts in algorithmic accountability. And the first wave could be, are these evaluations accurate? So when we think about these evaluations, are they actually accurate to some standard of ground truth, or are they not? So, and coming back to the earlier example from the earlier slide, is it the case that when the HR department uses the AI to parse applicants for nervousness and mood, does it turn out that people that they've said put up a red flag or a yellow flag of warning saying they might be nervous or moody, are they actually that way, right? With the children who are deemed aggressive, were they actually aggressive, or did later analysis show that they weren't? Just by virtue of what I've described, you can already see the difficulties of drilling down to ground truth in these areas, right? I mean, it's going to be very interesting to sort of think about, if you had some sort of study with the aggression detectors in schools, and then later on the principal or others has to decide, was the child actually unduly aggressive or not? We can all imagine what a difficult judgment call that would be, and how that judgment call itself, there's so much pressure for those in charge just to outsource it to a machine, right? So this is worrisome. And I think a second, but it doesn't get rid of the first wave concerns. It just sort of makes us, I think it should make us more worried about applying a natural science model here as opposed to a social science model. And I think that actually is the deep root of all of the problems that I've just described, is that so often the mindset from the natural sciences is being inappropriately applied to the social sciences. And of course, if you want a deep philosophy of social science critique there, I mean, I think that Mark Bevere and Jason Blakely's work critiquing naturalism is excellent on that sort of topic. But I think in general, it's we can all see the problem. You don't necessarily need to get into the philosophy of social science and behaviorism versus phenomenology to understand the problems here when we start treating humans as the type of objects that can be classified, moved, sorted, ranked, rated as objects in the natural world. The second first wave critique is, of course, the data protection issue. Right. The concern there, and it's quite a valid concern, is that data collected on the fly for some small purpose, for some particular purpose, is going to be inappropriately used in another purpose. And I think that this sort of data, and of course, there's further data protection issues. I mean, some people will argue that some of this data should not be collected at all. And that's what we'll get into in the third wave. But I think in terms of thinking about if we allow for the data to be collected, analyzed, used, transferred, sold, collated for public health purposes, et cetera, we want to make sure that all of that data is actually protected and secured. And all too often in these scenarios, that's not the case. You don't see the data actually being adequately secured given its sensitivity. Those are what I would describe as the first wave concerns. The second wave concerns can be on the level of, are they discriminatory in intent? And even if not, do they have a disparate impact? Right, so we can have a system that's entirely accurate to some account of ground truth. It can be a system that realizes the extant legal protections of data and restrictions on its collection, analysis, and use. But we can still ask, was it made in a way that was intended to discriminate against certain groups? And certainly, I think this is a huge concern now, particularly in the regulation of algorithms and housing. The Trump administration here put out a rule a couple of years ago that attempted to give something approaching carte blanche immunity to discriminatory to entities engaged in discriminatory activities to the extent they used approved algorithmic systems to do so. And of course, that when you see those types of immunities given, and of course, as Martha Poon has shown, going all the way back to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and some of its emphases on formal criteria as opposed to human judgment, there have been rewards given to entities that try to move into the algorithmic realm by regulators. But nevertheless, and that makes a lot of sense in terms of trying to have some level of consistency in the application of standards. However, there's still a deep concern here when we think about the possibility that someone could intend something and then hide it in the algorithm, or sort of pick algorithms that ultimately have a discriminatory impact. And so what I would say here is that there could be either discrimination in intent, or there could be a disparate impact. In each of these situations, for example, there may be no intent to have an aggression detector that primarily chooses persons of a certain background as aggressive, and yet nevertheless, it might tend to do so simply because it has, it's misinterpreting or in other ways doing a bad job with respect to its system. And so I think that this is a really big issue with respect to the second wave, making sure that as the systems are deployed, that they aren't discriminatory. A third wave arises, and by the way, I have a post from a few years ago on the Law and Political Economy project called 2 Waves of Algorithmic Accountability, but I actually, at this point, think the periodization is better as 3 waves, and I'm sure that there will be historians of science and historians of social science and those engaged in the social studies of science who will let me know that there's probably actually many more waves. But for our purposes, just for a simple cut, these 3 waves. A third wave, though, I think goes beyond even if we know that the systems are accurate and that they are non-discriminatory. Let's say that we get to that point. And I think that that is the ultimate goal of much of the work now in fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, the FACT ML conference and other conferences in that general bailiwick. So if we go to the third wave, we could nevertheless be concerned that these systems are alienating. And here, what I'm trying to do in more recent work is to recover some concepts from sociology, from the sociology of knowledge, particularly about systems that leave us with a sense of meaninglessness and powerlessness. Of course, those are only 2 of the categories of alienation that were enumerated in Melvin Siemens' classic, 1960 article on alienation. But I think they're the most relevant for us here. Right. And I think that there's something to be said about the problems arising out of even formal evaluative criteria via machine learning, if they give us a sense that we have no real ability to change things or to make things better for ourselves. Right. So if you have a system that essentially is throwing people out of the applicant pool based on how often they blink per minute, that feels kind of meaningless. It feels like, well, my blink rate really, I don't see the relationship between that and my performance at work. And similarly, I think that the powerlessness comes in when facing systems that have are so complex and distant that it is very difficult to understand how, if any way, one could actually change them. And perhaps the ability to appeal to a human ameliorates this concern. There's a growing literature now on humans in the loop of some of these algorithmic systems. But nevertheless, you still have problems of automation bias. You still have some other issues. And I think what the real challenge here, coming out of the third wave, is going to be on 2 levels. One is to go along with one of the themes of new laws of robotics, how to develop socio-technical systems where these mechanical judgments, AI judgments, are informing responsible professional decision makers, but are not replacing them. I think that's going to be key in many of these situations. And I find it kind of remarkable how often, even in places that seem quite amenable to an immediate snap judgment, like, for example, a red light camera taking a picture of a car going under the traffic light when it has turned red, right? That would seem like the most promising application imaginable of automated traffic or road regulation. And yet still, there are jurisdictions like New York City where that picture of the car is sent to red light camera technicians to do a final review on. Now, this may be something that is utterly redundant. It may be seen as feather bedding or a provision of jobs that just are without really much regard to the ultimate purpose of the jobs. But I think that there's also something disclosed in it, which I think is something of a commendable wisdom about the possibility of these systems simply making decisions on their own, say automatically deducting money from someone's account or something along those lines. And so that's going to be one part is, how do you sort of build these socio-technical systems where humans and machines work together in a more constructive and accountable way? The second, I think, is that sometimes there's going to be bans, right? So Access Now has recently been campaigning in Europe for a ban on the automated recognition of gender and sexual orientation. I think one of their slogans has been, computers are binary, but humans are not. And this raises both, I think, an epistemological and a moral critique of these sort of automated recognition systems. The epistemological critique, which I think Oz Keys has pursued and others in very interesting work sort of about the perils to the transgender community here and to others, is the problem of can these systems really recognize the complexity, and not only the existing complexity, but the ongoing nature of the contestation over concepts of gender and social sexual orientation. The direct moral critique also, I think resonates there and applies also to jurisdictions where, for example, being LGBTQ plus is stigmatized, is subject to punishment, et cetera. And so I think there's going to be some very difficult, but I think important decisions made that some of these systems just simply should not exist, and that they should not be out there to tempt intolerant despots going after the LGBTQ plus community in various places. Now, a broad theme here is that, for many years, maybe this was the 0th wave of algorithmic accountability, there was a concern that, computers can't do certain things. That was certainly the first book by Hubert Dreyfus, and then Dreyfus updated it with the latter book called What Computers Still Can't Do, I believe from 1999. But I think that the more interesting debate in many of these areas is what they should not do. Even if you can do many of these things, there's often situations where the computer should not be doing it. It should actually be something that a responsible human being is going to be responsible for. So just to go through, just to summarize just what I've gone through so far, the ways of algorithmic accountability are about sort of there's complementary narrativity and tension among those waves, right? So some people who are trying to make these systems better may be frustrated by those who are trying to make these systems, who are trying to get rid of the systems altogether, right? And that's going to be an interesting thing to negotiate. But I think ultimately there's opportunity for both sides to work together in the sense that they all recognize that the systems as they exist now are really not serving people nearly as well as they can. I've given financial and medical examples. I can give further ones, but I want to make sure that we embed AI in political economic narratives, right? We have to think about, how do we embed these systems in a narrative about a more just, inclusive, and fair society, rather than, I think, coming in after the technology has been developed and trying to limit it in some way. And I think that the two narratives of formalizing judgment that I want to put forward is that sometimes formalizing judgment will be something that is going to be increasing fairness when there is excessive play in the joints, discretion among human decision makers. But sometimes it will fail to do so or will make things worse. And I think those are the key concerns about how we embed each of these examples that I've already given into a larger narrative of formalizing judgment. Now, one of the things I wanted to note here is that do formal rules lead to judgment or lead to fairness? It may depend on your conception of the rule of law. So there are two conceptions of the rule of law that favor formalism. right? Historicist conceptions associate the rule of law with rule by norms laid down by legitimate lawmaking authorities prior to their application. And formalist conceptions define the ideal, if not necessary, form of law as that of a rule conceived as a clear prescription that exists prior to its application and that determines appropriate conduct. And so in these situations, if you want to make sure that there's a rule existing beforehand, expert systems especially, but even some forms of machine learning, can help us realize this type of formalism. And on these views, a machine with formalized criteria might be fairer than persons who lack such criteria. And a lot depends on whether we think the personal freedom of a judge is a hallmark of wise discretion to creatively assess a situation, or bias that cannot be formalized into a rule-based, such as an algorithmic, or points-based, like a quantified science of judgment. And I put in that term science of judgment there just to be a little provocative, because I feel like that's the end game for much of the formalized evaluative criteria, is to make a science of judgment. But I think that what's so fascinating is if you look at the broader epistemological landscape, often science is in tension with judgment. Science is seen as something, judgment is seen as what comes in when science has run out. When our knowledge runs out, we have to make a judgment. And this question about, the first characterization of wise discretion, there is a certain political valence sometimes to these scenarios as well. And I don't know if it's an entirely inaccurate one, but I certainly remember the controversy over Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the US Supreme Court during her confirmation was asked about, I believe it was a speech in which she talked about being empathetic. She said that I can be particularly empathetic given my life experience, my background. And a lot of conservatives at the time said, well, this is really troubling, that we're seeing, and just to sort of retrofit current rhetoric to the past, we're seeing a sort of liberal snowflake trying to make people's feelings matters, but feelings don't matter. What really matters is the text of the law and the rules of the law. And I think that is something that, it does fit into a certain broader ideological constellation that tends to see, say, whatever the quote unquote market outcomes are, that those are just, however the things shake out with respect to the law, those are just in restricting those types of discretion. Now, of course, discretion can have other very different political valences, so I don't want to say that it always leads in a certain direction, but I do think that sort of mapping ideologically is helpful for us. I also wanted to say there are some great lessons from Ben Green and Salome Villejuan in their paper, Algorithmic Realism, Expanding the Boundaries of Algorithmic Thought. And in this paper, they have diagnosed the dominant mode of algorithmic reasoning as algorithmic formalism. So just like the legal formalism that I've just described and critiqued, their concern is that there's an algorithmic formalism and that these formalist orientations lead to harmful algorithmic interventions. There's this sense that essentially, we can fix in stone some set of rules and procedures, either in a direct application of rules in expert systems or at a sort of higher level of information processing in some of the more advanced forms of AI and machine learning. And the thought behind Green and Villejuan is to say that essentially they're very worried about this application. They want to address these harms by pursuing a new mode of algorithmic thinking that's attentive to the internal limits of algorithms and to the social concerns that fall beyond the bounds of algorithmic formalism. Right. And I think in the second wave, algorithmic accountability that I mentioned earlier, those can include those sort of disparate impact concerns. Right. There are broad social concerns that come out with respect to algorithms that seem to be privileging one social group above others, or to have other forms of troubling effects. And this leads them to ideas such as from universal principles to contextual grounding, right? From objective decisions to some political assessments, and from internalist boundaries to porous analysis. And in each of these examples, what I particularly love about this paper is that Green and Villejuan are saying that essentially that all of these areas of evolution that they're prescribing for algorithmic approaches to evaluating, ranking, rating, sorting, classifying humans and institutions, all of them were part of the intellectual development of law in, say, the 1910s to the 1940s, right? Over that time period, there was an enormous struggle, intellectual struggle, between formalists and realists. And the realists sort of came to, they were particularly smart in their moniker, right? Calling themselves, we're part of the real, right? You're part of this sort of imaginary abstracted world. Whereas us legal realists, we understand the real consequences of decisions. And this goes back even so far as like Louis Brandeis in a case called, I think it was in, I think that the Brandeis brief was in Lochner versus New York, although I hope I'm not embarrassing myself if that is not the case. But it was a case involving, I believe about it was a case involving limiting working hours. It's something to do about labor protections and in the Brandeis brief. And what the Brandeis brief involved was a long empirical study of what was going on in society, so that when you had judges who said, you know, we believe that anyone should be able to contract to work any number of hours that they want. If I want to contract to work 10 hours a week, I should be able to. If someone down the street wants to be able to contract to work 120 hours a week, they should be able to. There should be no, that's a constitutional principle of freedom of contract, and there can be no law or no other effort by other lawmakers to stop that type of arrangement. Okay, so that was sort of legal formalism at its apex, right? And what Brandeis did is he did engage in normal formal legal reasoning, but he also said, here's what happens to people that have to work 120 hours a week, right? They agree to it, but within, say, months, they're suffering, they're sick. Maybe they bring the sickness to work, that spreads sickness throughout the community, et cetera. These sorts of things I think are really sort of important in thinking about, how we are considering the application of these legal principles. And I think that this idea of moving from universalistic principles to understanding what are the actual effects is going to be a big theme going forward of this third wave of algorithmic accountability and of making these systems more fair and just in general. I'd also note that objective decisions, political assessments, all that I mean there to say is that essentially we need to include objectivity, of course, but also to note how politics has affected that objectivity. And so that also means that as we move from internalist boundaries to porous analysis, that those who are making rules, be they legislators, judges, regulators, or within firms or within the contractors for the government, those who are writing up the structure of computing programs, who are writing up the applications of them to particular sets of data, that all of them are looking beyond, say, their own internalist standards of excellence for how that is to be done well, and thinking about the broader standards of social service, of how society can be served. And so, my bottom line here, in terms of just trying to wrapping up, because I realize that I have little time left. I do have some, there's much more I wish I could show, but I just wanted to sort of leave us today with this third conception of legal process, right? And so a third conception of legal process, getting beyond the formalist and historicist ones, is that legal process conceptions find the requisites of law necessary for the rule of law and all the ideals of fairness and justice and equal concern that it is supposed to embody, to be satisfied by a mixture of procedural fairness in the development and application of norms, an internal connection between notions of law and reasonableness, and sometimes this is merely assumed, but it's got to be our regulative ideal, reasoned elaboration of the connection between recognized pre-existing sources of legal authority and the determination of rights and responsibilities in particular cases, and some type of review, right? And I think there are analogs to each of these in the algorithmic accountability movement, right? And it's one reason why I focused in on this legal process conception in my article, Rule of Persons, Not Machines, which is freely available online if you want to see what it looks like for someone to apply these ideals to legal technology and algorithms in the legal sphere. But I think they have a broader applicability and a broader opportunity to enhance fairness if we find analogs for each of these for conceptions of legal process, conceptions of a rule of law, right? Procedural fairness in terms of, as different norms are being developed in some of these systems, are we having a broad community involved in shaping those norms, such as we see in administrative procedures with notice and comment rulemaking, right? Notice to the affected community, the opportunity for them to comment, the obligation of those setting these systems up to respond to and to acknowledge the comments as they do so. And the second point, internal connection between notions of law and reasonableness, I think is critically important when we think about explainability, right? I know we'll talk in a bit even more about explainability, but that's really an ideal of juridifying what should not be merely technical decisions, that there is this long unnoticed, but now critical juridical component to so many of the classification decisions that are made now by AI and ML systems. And further, part 3 is further elaboration of this sort of explainability type of criterion. And then finally, judicial review, the analog, I think, in many of our systems is some human in the loop or human to appeal to. And I think this right to have that level of intervention is really important and needs to be vindicated in many areas. Many people say that this is going to be costly, that it's problematic, but by my mind, that's one of the reasons why I and New Laws of Robotics have a whole chapter on monetary and fiscal policy in a new political economy of automation, because I think we need to sort of revalue these systems and rethink our overarching way of financing jobs and of guaranteeing jobs or guaranteeing some form of social support to individuals. And I think that this type of position will be part of that. So with that, I wanted to close up. I don't want to go too far over time.